Welcome. As you read in the bulletin, I'm sure you do this every Sunday. Adult education opportunities are intended for spiritual formation through biblical study and critical examination of cultural, social, and moral issues from a Christian perspective. And that states that on the top of our minutes for adult ed every time we meet. As such, I hope that all of the adult education sessions that we do, as tense as they may be sometimes, prompt all of us to lifelong learning through open dialogue with others of varied perspectives, may happen in the gathering area or over coffee somewhere, and in ongoing explorations. All of you have heard about my thinking processes that constantly are going on in my head. And for example, for me, dedicated to lifelong learning as I am, for the past couple of days, Larry and I have been up north. So, yep, I drag him into independent bookstores. And because I'm constantly thinking about things, when I see the displays of books about the Middle East, given all that we've been talking and I've been ruminating on these last few weeks and months and years, I picked up 2 books. There were a lot to choose from. But for me, I picked up Thomas Friedman's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. This has a brand new 2024 preface in it, which is, pretty heartfelt. It also has a chronology that I found helpful. A Middle East chronology. This one starts in 1882. So if you want a little brief chronology, that's kind of helpful. I also, by recommendation from friends, picked up Noah Tishby's. She's an Israeli activist, and A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth, which also in the back, rather than in the front, she also has a brief appendix about the history as well. And yep, here's my independent bookstore. So I was in Harbor Springs and Petoskey. Yep. So keep learning, keep exploring. We also, some of you remember Bud and Bee Van Eck. Bud was interim pastor here, and we stopped to see Bud and Bee yesterday, 99 years old. And sitting on Bud's table, Bud and Bee's table, is Heather Cox Richardson's new book on democracy. And I'm like, oh, who's reading Heather's book? And they're like, oh, we are. It's in our small group. I'm like, 99, in a small group, goes to Presbyterian Church in Traverse City, and is reading Heather's new book. I'm like, that's what all of us, in my opinion, need to be doing. Continuing to read and explore and talk with other people about varied perspectives in a civil way. So I hope every time we meet over the various topics that you are challenged. That's a part of our goal, to continue to learn and ruminate and think about and also explore what you can do and with your own life and how you can take action in your own life. So I'll talk next at the end about what we're going to do in the coming weeks as well. If you've seen Salt and Light, you've seen some of those descriptions as well. But thank you, and I'm glad you're all here. Thank you.
There we go. Am I on? Yes. Excellent. this time we've done the thing we obviously should have done from the start, which is we put my PowerPoint on your computer. And I think that's going to solve our problems. So we'll be able to use the various, awesome. The various stuff that I have here as sort of supplemental stuff to help us think through this. So I'm going to lift up a bunch of different voices that I think are worthy of being lifted up on this issue that I hope will help you understand a bit more. Mainly, I'm going to try to do a bit on Palestinians. How are Palestinians understanding and how have they understood, the past, let's say, 75, 80, 90 years, but we'll especially probably just be focusing on the last 25, as we have for most of my time here. I'm going to start. Is this ready to go? Exciting. How do I start videos? Just click again? Yep. Okay, great. So I've shown Yuval Noah Harari at least once. I think last week I did. It was a little choppy, but he got his point across pretty well. And I'm going to show another. This is like a minute long, but I think it's worth listening to. He is an Israeli historian, kind of becoming a public intellectual now at this point, ever since he wrote *Sapiens*. He's been out there. You can find him on podcasts. If you want to know more about him, hear more about him, just look up Yuval Noah Harari, and you'll have lots of choices of where to start with his work. *Sapiens* is a large, large book. It's the history of Homo sapiens. It's quite a work, but it's excellent. I would recommend it to you.
So this is why I write, for instance, these books, to tell the story of humanity, and not the story of Israel or the story of the Jewish nation. There is place also for these kind of local and tribal stories, but because we face these kind of global problems, we also need to think more in terms of global stories. And as I said before, ultimately, I think it's important to go down to the level of the body. What divides people one against the other is the fantasies in our mind. When you look in our fantasies, we are so different from each other. When you look at the level of the body, we are extremely similar to each other. So again, I'm not advocating abandoning the mind, but having a better balance between mind and body with more emphasis on our embodied existence, that would be very good for us. So.
I think, at a minimum, this idea that we need global stories, which is something I said last week, I believe, as well, and maybe I said it the first week as well. Global stories that connect us instead of doubling down on tribal stories that divide us. I think this is essential, maybe for the survival of humankind. If that sounds hyperbolic, I don't think it should. We're in the process of finishing ourselves off here on this planet. We really are. It's happening in front of our eyes. And ask Stephen Baumer-Prediger. He's been at this for how long have you been talking about how we're ruining the planet?
40 years.
40 years. And it's all coming to fruition, is it not? Yeah. And that's just sort of the biggest global problem we have amongst very, very many. Nuclear holocaust is definitely on the table. We're on an escalation ladder right now in the Middle East, right? We're waiting right now to see what the next piece of escalation is going to be. We are like in this moment. We know it's coming. This is a guarantee. Israel is going to strike Iran. Guarantee. Where are they going to strike is really the question that's being debated. And it's being debated by our leadership, American leadership. We could effectively decide this in a way. We do probably have that much power over Israel. We never use it. Joe Biden hasn't used it one single time with any effectiveness. If Republicans were not so beholden to Israel and Netanyahu in ways I really don't understand ultimately, they could just be absolutely hammering the Democratic Party as weak, which they love to do. They love it. But they won't do it right now. When Joe Biden is morally inept and weak, possibly leading us to nuclear war, they can't say anything. Why? Why? I mean, to some degree, I don't really understand anymore why, if I'm being honest. But the answer is because supporting Israel is more important. Being shown to be the biggest of all the supporters is the most important thing on this issue for Republicans, mostly also for Democrats, although this is changing in the Democratic Party. Obviously, do you have any questions about that? I didn't do that part, but I'm happy to take questions about that. It's a big issue. We could just talk the whole time about this, I understand, but I want to drill down on some more specifics. Okay. I don't know if it's a bummer how small that is, but I think it'll be okay. There's going to be subtitles on here. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates. Do people know Ta-Nehisi Coates? That's not him. I don't even know. Sorry, I didn't learn that guy's name. But there's a sense in which he's a stand-in in American media. Well represented part of American media, as you're about to see if you don't know. And he's the super pro-Israel part of the American media, which is, to some degree, and historically, the only part of American media that exists. Again, this is changing. So watch this interaction. Ta-Nehisi Coates went to Israel-Palestine. He went before October. I think it was a year ago. Not this past summer, but the summer before, 2023. And he recently finished and launched his book. It's called The Message. It's not just about Israel-Palestine, but there's a big chapter on it on Israel-Palestine, which I have not gotten to read yet. It came out very recently. So he's doing the rounds, being interviewed about it. And this was the interview he had with CBS Mornings.
Myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
Well, I would say the perspective that you just outlined, there is no shortage of that perspective in American media. That's the first thing I would say. I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard. And those were the stories that I was most occupied with. I wrote a 260-page book. It is not a treatise on the entirety of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
But if you were to read this book, you would be left wondering, why does any of Israel exist? What a horrific place, committing horrific acts on a daily basis. So I think the question is central and key. If Israel has a right to exist, and if your answer is no, then I guess the question becomes, why do the Palestinians have a right to exist? Why do 20 different Muslim countries have a
My
right
answer
to
is
exist?
that no country in this world establishes its ability to exist through rights. Countries establish their ability to exist through force, as America did. And so I think this question of right to Israel does exist. It's a fact. The question of its right is not a question that I would be faced with any other country.
But you write a book that delegitimizes the pillars of Israel. It seems like an effort to topple the whole building of it. So I come back to the question, and it's what I struggled with throughout this book. What is it that so particularly offends you about the existence of a Jewish state that is a Jewish safe place and not any of the other states out there?
There's nothing that offends me about a Jewish state. I am offended by the idea of states built on ethnocracy, no matter where they are.
Muslim included.
I would not want a state where any group of people lay down their citizenship rights based on ethnicity. The country of Israel is a state in which half the population exists on one tier of citizenship, and everybody else that's ruled by Israelis exists on another tier, including Palestinian Israeli citizens. The only people that exist on that first tier are Israeli Jews. Why do we support that? Why is that okay? I'm the child of Jim Crow. I'm the child of people that were born into a country where that was exactly the case, of American apartheid. I walk over there and I walk through the occupied territories and I walk down the street in Hebron. And a guy says to me, I can't walk down the street unless I profess my religion. I'm with another path. No. I want to. This is very, very important.
It is
extremely important.
Let me lay it down.
I'm working with the person that is guiding me is a Palestinian whose father, whose grandfather and grandmother was born in this town. And I have more freedom to walk than he does. He can't ride on certain roads. He can't get water in the same way that Israeli citizens who live less than a mile away from him can.
And why is that okay?
Why
is that? Why is there no agency in this book for the Palestinians? They exist in your narrative merely as victims of the Israelis, as though they were not offered peace at any juncture, as though they don't have a stake in this as well. What is their role in the lack of a Palestinian?
I have a very, 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 very moral compass about this. And again, perhaps it's because of my ancestry. Either apartheid is right or it's wrong. It's really, really simple. Either what I saw was right or it's wrong. I am, for instance, against the death penalty. What the person did to get the death penalty, it really doesn't matter to me. I don't care if they were selling a nickel bag of marijuana or if they were a serial killer. I am against the death penalty. I am against a state that discriminates against people on the basis of ethnicity. I'm against that. There is nothing the Palestinians could do that would make that okay for me. My book is not based on the hyper-morality
What's the last
of the Palestinian people.
In less than, because many people feel it's complicated. You say it's not complicated. Less than 20 seconds. What's your message?
Less than 20 seconds. I want people to read the book. And I don't make the assumption that somebody would just read the book and have read nothing else about it.
Okay. You're still invited to High Holidays. I'll see you at the show. I mean it, buddy.
You know, so I show that for a variety of reasons. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates does well there, and I agree with him, basically, in terms of the fundamentals, right? I also think it's interesting, it kind of got covered over in there, but he said something about not being interested in the hyper-morality of Palestinians, but he didn't really get a chance to explain that. But I found that really, even though it was kind of there in passing, really interesting. Because I think what he's getting at is the colonial nature of it all, which is to say, it's not that you inherently have rights, Palestinians, as human beings. It's that you need to demonstrate to us that you deserve them. And if you can do that well enough, then we might give them to you. That's been the Palestinian experience. And that's what he means when he says hypermorality. And that's what the gentleman is trying to get at when he says, you act like they had no agency, like they didn't pass up peace deals, like they've never committed suicide bombings, right? The idea being they've been delegitimized as people with rights. And they did it to themselves, it's their own fault. That's what he's saying there. That's what the gentleman is saying, and then Ta-Nehisi Coates is saying, I don't care what they did. I believe in human rights. And I don't say that some humans are human and deserve human rights, and other people are not human and don't deserve human rights. He's just like, that conversation's inconsequential to me. When we started doing this, and I'll say we just because it was my parents who started it, and I was involved in everything that was happening with them, right? Paying attention, learning with them, trying to think with them, as they were the first missionaries of the RCA in Israel-Palestine, trying to figure out how would you help in this situation? What could we do, right? I think we all probably feel that sort of helplessness just in general about all kinds of things. We're all like, I mean, imagine being like a couple from the RCA being dropped in Jerusalem and pretending you're going to figure out how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or even help, right? And the answer then to getting support to even start this was actually pretty simple. And it was being followed by a lot of denominations at that time, and still some today follow it, which is talk about Palestinian Christians. We might be able to sell Christians in the United States on caring about Palestinians if we inform them that there are Palestinian Christians. And it did work. I mean, it worked enough to get them support and to get things going. And this was after the Second Intifada, right? The things that he referenced, the car bombings, the children dying, being blown up. Those things happened. Palestinian militants did those things, right? Which I consider awful things, which I consider to have been morally terrible, but also tactically terrible. We didn't come out of the Second Intifada with Palestinians in a better position globally. Nobody thinks that. It's not true. So, in the United States, the way people were viewing Palestinians at that point, okay, so it's just after the Second Intifada and 5 years after 9/11, right? And you're going to start advocating for Arab people, the vast majority of whom are not Christian. They're Muslim. And that's true now. Less than 2% of Palestinians are Christian. And I think what happened was, you know, there was naivete on our part when we went there. We knew a good amount. I think my parents knew more than I did at that point. And then we sort of caught up and we kept going. And what we realized was that, yes, you can sell the idea of helping Palestinian Christians to American Christians. And you can then have some influence on what's happening there to some small degree. But what happened was we realized that Palestinian Christians' problem was not that they were Christian. It's fine that they're Christian in Palestinian society. Their problems do not stem from that. They're not persecuted for being Christian, right? They're not under occupation because they're Christian. They're persecuted and under occupation since 1967, kicked out of their land since 1948, because they're Muslim and Palestinian. That's their problem, mainly. And then we had a choice to make, right? Now that we know that the main problem is the occupation, the main problem, not the only problem, of course. There are problems in Palestinian society, just as there are problems in Israeli society, just as there are problems in American society, right? We have our radicals. A month from now, we might be thrown into utter chaos by our radicals. That's a real possibility. The Department of Homeland Security says the thing they're most worried about is violence by homegrown terrorists in our own country around the election. Right? We have our radicals as well, willing to kill people for what they think is correct, or the country they think we should be, whatever the case may be. But we knew now that the problem was mainly the Israeli occupation, and the thing that needed to end was the Israeli occupation. And so then we had to start talking about that. And then by doing that, we had to advocate for all Palestinians, most of whom are Muslim. And the truth is, in Christian churches, there's a lot more Islamophobia than there is anti-Semitism. That's my opinion. I mean, I don't know how I would prove that, right? It'd be hard to prove. But we could just say there's as much Islamophobia as anti-Semitism, maybe? Right? most of the places I've gone, so anecdotally speaking, I encounter much more Islamophobia than anti-Semitism. And I guarantee you in the year 2006 when we started this, after the Second Intifada, after September 11th, those numbers were not close then. They were not close. So we're stuck trying to do it this way, right? We're stuck trying to explain why it is that the Israeli occupation is unjust and needs to end. And then we're stuck also having to explain every bad action by any Palestinian ever. And if we show the bad actions by Israelis, right, then we might be anti-Semitic. Possibly. It's worth consideration. It's not if we say bad things about Jewish people, because we don't do that. Because in Israel-Palestine, our partners are Jewish and Israeli, and also Palestinian and Muslim and Christian. And they're the ones who taught us all this. They're the ones who convinced us that the problem was the Israeli occupation. They're the ones in my film trying to show you that the problem is the Israeli occupation. So I don't think the anti-Semitic slur is fair. But it's common, right? When you end up moving from please care about Palestinian Christians to please care about all Palestinians because they're being oppressed by Israel. All right. Questions? So let's learn a little bit about Palestinians. I'm going to skip that. I said that I thought the Second Intifada and the violence of the Second Intifada was a huge mistake. Not only morally, I think that's kind of obvious, though I will say 1,000, in the Second Intifada, about 1,000, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but about 1,000 Israelis were killed, which is 1,000 too many. That's over the course of 5-6 years. Over that same time period, 3,000 Palestinians were killed. But it still was a disaster for Palestinians ultimately. And this is from, I'm not going to get the slide for him, but Rashid Khalidi, or some say Khalidi, wrote a book called The 100 Years War Against Palestine. And this is from his book. So he's Palestinian American, history professor at Columbia. And this is his analysis of the ways in which the Second Intifada was tragic and disastrous for Palestinians. Is that enough setup? Maybe too much?
Coming after the collapse of the Camp David summit, Israel's reoccupation of the cities and towns of the West Bank and Gaza Strip shattered any remaining pretense that the Palestinians had or would acquire something approaching sovereignty or real authority over any part of their land. It exacerbated the political differences among Palestinians and underlined the absence of a viable alternative strategy, revealing the failure of both the PLO's diplomatic course and the armed violence of Hamas and others. These events showed that Oslo had failed, that the use of guns and suicide bombings had failed, and that for all the casualties inflicted on Israeli civilians, the biggest losers in every way were the Palestinians. Another consequence was that the terrible violence of the Second Intifada erased the positive image of Palestinians that had evolved since 1982 and through the First Intifada and the peace negotiations. With horrifying scenes of recurrent suicide bombings transmitting globally, and with this coverage eclipsing that of the much greater violence perpetrated against the Palestinians, Israelis ceased to be seen as oppressors, reverting to the more familiar role of victims of irrational, fanatical tormentors.
That last line, I think, is really, really important in terms of how the world ended up viewing Palestinians and Israelis after the Second Intifada. After the first Intifada, right, this is how we ended up into the Oslo Accords. So there was this idea that we were going into these peace negotiations. They were signed by Arafat and by Rabin. There was optimism on both sides. Let's say in the general Palestinian public and Israeli public, there was general optimism. And then on both sides, you had hardened people that were against it. And so they were trying to screw up this process, meaning Palestinian militants on one side and the Israeli settler movement on the other side. This ended up leading to the assassination of Rabin, for example, by an Israeli settler. And then the Oslo process begins to sort of just fall apart, and you end up in the Second Intifada and all this violence. And you come out and you end up with this characterization, right? Israelis go from oppressors, sort of in the mind, or at least this view of them was gaining for Palestinians in the public, in the world, and that just kind of gets wiped out. And they go back to being, as he says, victims. Questions about anything else in there or anything I've said so far? All right, let me see where I want to go next. I think I can just go to the next one. So there is some good work done in the West Bank and Gaza by, let me get the name right, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. That gives us an idea of what Palestinians are thinking. These are done, I think I read that they're done face-to-face. I mean, how would you do them in Gaza at the moment anyways, right? And the director is Khalil Shak. I didn't practice that one. Do you think we should say Shikaki? I think that's as good as I can do. And he is in a conversation here, and he's explaining, I think helpfully, the views of Palestinians. This one, I believe, is about their views of Hamas.
And that is because Hamas is now representing armed resistance to Israel. The Palestinians have come during the last decade or so, gradually, but certainly during the last 2 years, to the conclusion that Israelis understand certainly the language of force a lot more than they understand the language of diplomacy and negotiations, and that the Israelis are comfortable with the status quo. They will never end the Israeli occupation unless the Palestinians inflict sufficient pain and suffering on them to convince them that they must end the occupation, and that therefore armed struggle, violence, is indeed the most effective means. Hamas represents that. West Bankers who have come to the conclusion that this is the only effective way, this is particularly a majority in the West Bank, in fact, have come to this conclusion as a result of the formation of the current Israeli government, perceived by the Palestinians as the most extreme government in Israel's history, that is intent on annexing Palestinian territories and expelling the population, and that for this reason the Palestinians have no choice but to resort to armed struggle in order to prevent that from happening. They see settler violence in the West Bank expanding considerably, and they believe that the only way to stop this violence is for the Palestinians to arm themselves and to challenge the settlers when they attack. All of this is happening in the West Bank before October the 7th. Then comes October the 7th, and so Hamas now represents itself as the organization that represents those aspirations. These are not values, these are policies and measures that people in the West Bank would like to see happening. They see Hamas embodying that. Again, this is the fifth war between Israel and Hamas.
So I don't think that the Palestinians, the way he's describing how the Palestinians are seeing the Israelis, right, and what the Israelis are doing, and what the Israelis are willing to do and not willing to do, I think they have that all correct, Palestinians. I don't think if they sat peacefully and quietly, as they have for years at a time while being under occupation, that that would somehow lead to a Palestinian state or lead to Palestinian self-determination in some way. It wouldn't. This was not the track we've been on. We've not been on it for a while. So they're right. about what they're up against, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, many others. And so they resort to violence because, as they say, and as they think, this is something that Israel understands. I think that's also true. Israel does understand violence. Israel does operate in this way, with violence. You know, over the last 25 years, probably since 1967, the way that Israel has kept Palestinians in check, and they have by and large. I mean, the amount of deaths, Israeli deaths, all of them tragic, since 1967, it's not very high, considering. It's not. I mean, I've had people come and speak to our groups and say, it's an amazing military achievement that there have not been more deaths of Israelis when you are keeping people under these conditions. And I believe that is absolutely true. They're all tragic. None of these innocent people should die. I don't like that they're choosing this path. I think it, again, will backfire ultimately, as the Second Intifada violence backfired. But I want you to understand where they're coming from. Questions about that? Please.
It's not a question, just a comment. We wait for
Oh, they want you to speak into the mic.
You referred earlier to the leverage that the United States and others have over this situation, and repeatedly in situations of apartheid in our own subjugation of blacks in the South or
Right.
apartheid in South Africa, it's a third party from outside that enables these things to come to any kind of resolution. And there has to be a third party influence here that it doesn't just let this go on and on.
Yeah. The problem is we don't have that third party at the moment. The United States has tried to play that role. We've been unsuccessful, mainly because we've been so deferential to the Israelis. That's why these deals have failed. So at Camp David in 2000, a really simple offer here is to say, you get the West Bank, you get the Gaza Strip, and you get East Jerusalem as your capital. That's what they want. Where this gets tripped up sometimes is the West Bank is now full of illegal settlements, and so is East Jerusalem, to the tune of 600,000. It could be 650 now. It's hard to keep up with the numbers. They don't go down, they only go up. And Israel doesn't want to give those up. They built them all knowing they were illegal. From the minute they built them, they knew that. We told them that. We've been telling them that over and over. But they want to keep them, which is like 9, 10, I don't know what percent of the West Bank that is now. 10, 15, let's say, somewhere in there. And then they want to give Palestinians some other lands somewhere. It wasn't even named in the Camp David Accords that were an attempt to finally broker a solution. Like the end of the Oslo Accords would be this big solution. No, they wanted to keep it. And then they wanted to give Palestinians 1% of some land that Palestinians don't want or care about. And Israelis obviously don't want or care about, or otherwise they'd take that land and give the 9% of settlements to Palestinians. The solution here is everybody knows it. Everybody basically agrees on it. But Israelis have never wanted to give that to Palestinians. Not that much. It's too much. Part of Jerusalem, it's too much. All of Jerusalem is Israelis, in their opinion. They're not going to give any of it for peace. Those settlements, all built illegally, no. We're going to keep most of them. And then they want Palestinians to agree to that. And they want to blame Palestinians for not agreeing to it. I wouldn't agree to it. Why? Why should they get to keep illegal settlements that they knew were illegal when they built them? Why? I mean, they've utterly destroyed Gaza, right? It's fine. They deserved it because of Hamas. right? All that's gonna, I mean, how are we gonna rebuild all of that? Those are homes for 2 million people. And they can't give up 600,000, you know, they can't move 600,000 people who are there illegally out. I don't get it. There's somebody here who has a question.
Mine is also a comment, a lot of which is repetitious of what you have been saying. But it's a little bit like the first part of the Joseph story. Joseph's father gave him lots of money, as we have for years been giving Israel lots of money, to say nothing of the fact that the Jewish community gives Israel a lot of money. And of course, then all of their neighbors are jealous, and so they don't like us, and so we've caused a lot of hatred on their part. And then the Jewish people in Israel have treated the Palestinians miserably for years and years, building 13-foot tall stainless steel walls with our money as well as their own, and done all kinds of nasty things to the Palestinians. You could almost feel that this was going to happen, something was going to happen. And then it did, of course. And now we're at this terrible point where Netanyahu doesn't want to see our point of view at all. And now we're sending troops over there. I think that's the worst thing in the world we can do, because if even 5 American troops are killed, you know, we're at war.
Yeah.
That's bad.
Thank you. Absolutely. There's some more over here. Oh, good. We got a second mic. It's not. Maybe we'll have to get you the other one. Oh.
Am I on now?
You
Okay.
got it. Good job.
Can you please comment on the misconception or conception of the Muslim world to wipe Israel off the face of the earth into the sea and their stand on security?
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely still radical groups in the Middle East that would like to wipe Israel off the map. For sure. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that. I don't think they represent the majority of Palestinians, and they definitely don't represent the majority of Arabs or Arab countries. The majority of the Arab population wants a solution to this problem. They care about Palestinians and what's happening to them. Not so much the leadership in the Arab countries, because it's pretty corrupt in some of them. I don't want to say most of them, because I don't know that to be true. You know, I don't think these Arab countries have not been great actors on behalf of Palestinians overall. They haven't been. Partially because none of them have that power. I mean, name me an Arab country that can come up against the United States and Europe. What is it? Saudi Arabia? No, they want to deal so that we give them weapons that they need, right? Nobody can come at us. So partially they don't have a lot of power. But no, I don't think that speaks for the majority of the Arab population. In the same way that I don't think, although this is becoming increasingly more difficult to say, I don't think the majority of the Israeli population wants to see Palestinians continue to live in these conditions. I'm less certain of that, to be honest. But even if they do, okay. It doesn't mean you can't work out a peace deal and those opinions can't be changed. Of course they can be changed. You know, Bassam Aramim, who speaks to our groups, reminds us that, like, there's a German embassy in Israel. I mean, just think about that for like a second, and then tell me that we can't solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then explain to me how that's possible, that we can have a German embassy in Israel, but we can't solve this conflict. We can.
So there are Palestinians that live in Israel. They're a second tier in terms of some rights and so forth you've mentioned.
Right. It's just because Israel is a country for the Jewish people.
Right.
So everybody else is
okay,
secondary
but
in
here's-
that way.
Okay, so my
Yeah.
point is, why can't you have a Palestinian state where Jewish folk, they're now called settlers,
Yeah.
you know, make that boundary so that the settler area still really is in Palestine, and you've got some Jewish folk living in Palestine.
Yeah.
The fact is that people are living there, and it foments gangs and just horrible behavior on the part of the settlers toward the Palestinians. My daughter was there when she was 16 in high school, and with a peace group, and they were meeting together. And she had the experience of being at the beach with the Palestinians, and the settlers were all marching around with Uzi guns.
Yeah.
And the girl said, "Don't look at their eyes. Don't look at them, or we're in trouble."
Mm-hmm.
So I know the terror that they must be feeling. That has to change. You have to take the Uzis away from the settlers. But is there any possibility, or is there any discussion, that yes, these Jewish folk can continue to live in those communities, but they're going to be in Palestine?
Yeah. So the most elegant solution to this problem is one big democratic state with equal rights for everybody, which, right, sounds like an impossibility. I don't think it's true that it's an impossibility. You already have Palestinians. They already live together in so many ways right now. And that was true of Gaza up until like 2005. So it's always weird when we're like, they can't live together, except that they do constantly, and most of the time without violence. Yeah, both people groups have a tie to this land, and for both of them it's legitimate. It is. It's legitimate for both groups. I don't think it should have been done in the way that it was done in 48. It was a mistake. We allowed a minority group who had come in very, very recently to mainly take over the land, and we didn't allow the native population to really have a voice. I know that they rejected the partition plan, and that's supposed to mean that they had their chance. They rejected it. They had good reasons to reject it. Even at the time of the partition plan, they were 66% of the population. They were offered 45% of the land. Why would they take that? Why should they have to take that? The simple solution is one democratic country. Everybody then who has, there are settlers who feel real tie to parts outside of Jerusalem and to the north up by Nablus and Jenin, and in the south at Hebron, right? Under one democratic state, everybody can live where they want. But they have to live together in peace, right? So it's the most elegant solution by far, because there's also this thing called the right of return, which is a right granted to Palestinians and to all refugees to return to your homeland. And there are Palestinians who want to do that. Well, their homeland, for those people who are refugees, is in now the state of Israel. You know, Yahya Sinwar, a really bad guy, leading the military wing of Hamas, his parents were from Ashkelon, which is like just a bit north of Gaza where he is now stuck. And for reasons sometimes that I don't fully understand, the tie that Palestinians, and now I'd say some Israelis, feel to their homelands where their parents raised them or where they grew up is strong. It matters to them. And it's allowed to matter to them. There are Americans who are very tied to their piece of land. I mean, go out to Montana or whatever, you know. They get really protective of it and fight our government about it. It's not as like we can't understand people being tied to a strip of land. It's a thing. In this scenario, right, Yahya Sinwar, he's eventually going to be killed by Israel. Let's just all be clear about that. You know, he would return with his family to Ashkelon and live in peace. I know we think that's impossible. I actually don't think it is, even with a guy like Yahya Sinwar, but I might be wrong about him. Yeah.
For several years, I have been getting an email every day, with the exception of Shabbat, from Israel365.com. I don't know if you're aware of it. It is an organization that was started by a rabbi from Columbus who emigrated to Israel as part of the Aliyah movement. The reason I subscribed was because they have a verse of the day that's also transliterated into Hebrew, and it just keeps me from going really rusty. So, in any event,
I see.
But the whole ethos of Israel 365 is that Israel has a God-given right to that land.
Right.
And not only do these folks believe it with great sincerity, but they also have many American Christians who believe that with equal great sincerity. So my question is, in your opinion, is it possible to have reasonable conversation with people who are of that persuasion? And if so, how?
Yeah. I'd say, I mean, you can have reasonable conversation with them. I'm sure you could. I don't think you're going to change their minds. I usually try and change their minds by saying, like, if this requires the total elimination of 5 million Palestinians for this God-given right to be finally enshrined for them, would that be okay? I mean, it was okay initially when they came into the land to slaughter the people. That's biblical. By God. So, I mean, the Bible allows for a lot of stuff. They could easily claim, like, we're going to wipe these people out. Our God says it's our land. He let them wipe us out. He let us wipe them out before. We'll wipe them out again. I can't say to you, hey, that's not biblical. It is biblical. And it's not just Old Testament. Revelation, the end of all this, we'll wipe out our enemies. We'll win. We're on top. You can have that biblical God if you want. It's ugly. I reject it. That's what I'd say.
Josh, under the Reformed Church, I understand, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that one of the things you did with your family was to sponsor trips to Palestine and Israel. And tell us a little bit about the value of those trips for whomever was involved.
So Ta-Nehisi Coates says this as well, that it was just, there was nothing quite like going to these places and experiencing these places and seeing. So he tells a story, for example, of going, he's wanting to go to the Dome of the Rock, but he wants to go through the Muslim checkpoints. As far as I understand, he's atheist, but so I don't think he's Muslim, but he wanted to see what it was like to experience trying to get to Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock as Muslims do. So he said he went there with a group of other Muslims, and he said we showed them our ID, and then we sat there, and we waited. And we didn't know why we waited. We waited there until they allowed us to go through, and he said it was, I don't remember how long, it was maybe 10, 15 minutes. And he said we waited because they wanted to make us wait, and they could. Right? Now, I explained that to you, but I guarantee you if you go there and have that experience, you have a bodily experience. Probably of anger, sort of disgust, maybe like a little bit of like you feel like you want to revolt in that moment because you're used to being in this country and not suffering those indignities. And some people do, you know. If you're international, you're an American, you can yell at Israeli troops if you want, and it'd probably go fine for you. Yeah, it does make a difference. The hard part is it's expensive. It's $5,000, you know, to go. Not everybody can do that, which is why these types of things and the documentary I made was an attempt to bring that experience to people without them having to go. But yes, going is different. than just hearing.
I would like to ask you, in the description of the conflict here, it reminds me on a much smaller scale of the Irish Troubles. And that problem was solved, well, I say solved, it's an uneasy piece, but a piece, by someone that was within the group that finally became tired of the bloodshed. Would it not be a good thing if those of us who are concerned by the violence over there supported an Israeli group that also was tired of the violence and give them support to help change the government of Israel so it would come from within, but from the violent power?
Yeah. We do some of that, meaning the groups that we bring people to are groups that are trying to do that, right, in Israel-Palestine. So we do some of that. Those groups are so small and inconsequential right now. Their power is as diminished as it has ever been in Israeli society. It is ever moving to the right. When Netanyahu ends his reign of terror here, whoever replaces him will be as right-wing as he is, maybe, if we're lucky, without the corruption. But everything else will be roughly the same. Maybe we don't get these religious zealots as a part of the cabinet, Smotrich, who's the finance minister, and Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister. These are people formerly labeled as terrorists by Israel. Maybe we don't get that, but we don't really get a significant change in Israeli society, even by leadership change. And I really don't know how you change Israeli society at this point such that it becomes open to taking risks for peace. I mean, look at it right now. They'd sooner fight the whole world. I think they'd sooner see the whole world burn. I mean, and we're darn close to that right now. I mean, they're bombing in Lebanon. They've killed maybe 2,000 in Lebanon already, at least 1,000. They're still bombing in Gaza. They're going to hit Iran. We're a long way from the changes in Israeli society that we need, I'm sorry to say. And I don't even know where to start. I guess this would probably have to be the last question.
In that CBS clip that we saw, the idea of denying the rights of the Israeli state, that's kind of I hear that often from the right. In today's context, where does that sort of line of understanding come from? Considering what you just said about, I mean, it's a established state right now.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Militarily and so on.
Yeah. I think he made a really good point there, which is this idea that, like, these states exist by virtue of some sort of rights or their... That's not how any of these nations came into being. They all came into being mostly under very strange and tragic circumstances most of the time. So, like, this idea, does it have a right? Do we have a right? It's inconsequential language, really. He's right to say it exists. It's not going anywhere. That's right. It does exist. It's not going anywhere. I don't even know what it would mean to dismantle, like, the Israeli state. How would that even happen? You know, it's not a thing that's going to happen or needs to be anybody needs to be concerned about. But the thing is what he comes back, there's two people groups there. And only one of them has been given the right of self-determination. And until you have a political solution that gives them both that, we're going to keep getting this. You can guarantee it.
Josh, you seem very sad, and you've made us all very sad. So I want to give you a brief quote by Margaret Mead. Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm sad. I'm pissed. I'm mad. I'm like really, really fed up. I'm tired of the BS. I'm so tired of it. I'll end with this. This is not a Security Council. That's actually a big reason why this isn't more consequential. This is the UN General Assembly has adopted a resolution demanding Israel end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory within a year. This vote was held on September 18, 2024, in favor 124 countries, against 14, abstention 43. Why is that not meaningful? Because those countries are not important and powerful. But guess what they all are? Many of them former colonized countries that got their independence. So they understand Palestinians. They understand what Palestinians are lacking. And it matters to them. But it doesn't matter to us, the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks.
Indeed, make us think and dream. Do any of you dream like peace is taking place and you can't recognize the faces, and you're like, wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, who was that? Who did that? And like, yeah, and yeah, see, these are the reasons why you can pray for my husband, because, you know, dinner is like all these questions. And like, I just want to know. And yeah. Thank you, Josh, for making us think and to continue to learn and explore and have conversations with a whole variety of people. Thank you. Eric, a former presenter, has asked for a couple minutes. I'll give you a couple minutes, Eric, about a trip that he is going to sponsor soon.
So I joined the church last spring and gave a talk as a part of this series last late winter about my work as a lighting designer and how my faith impacts my lighting and whatnot. It was great. Some of you were here. Just a completely different part of the world. So Hope College, where I'm a faculty member, has what they call the global travel program. It's for folks that are not necessarily in any way directly connected to Hope College. You can be a alumnus, you can be a student. This is largely for alumni. You can be not just somebody who knows Hope College exists, which it's pretty hard to be in this town and not know that's true. So they do trips all across all around the world, and I get to be a faculty representative on a trip that's going to Scotland in August. It's 10 days. It's some time at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is where I get to talk about the theater of it all, and then up into the Highlands for some sightseeing and some really beautiful experiences and some history, and we'll talk about light. It'll be great. And I just want to make sure that y'all are aware of it, because y'all are the kind of people that would like something that is curious and about learning and exploring the world. So I've got some extra brochures over here. So please, if you're curious, come check it out.
Appreciate that. Next week, David Myers will be back from his trip out west, and he will be back and doing a presentation on misinformation. I could say sarcastically, I wonder where he's possibly going to get, any information for that. But I think we all know that he has plenty of content to work with. So David will be here next week, and then that will be followed by Bob Leidens doing a presentation. Chapter from his latest book, and we'll talk about Christian stewardship just before we have at the end of the month a presentation about the budget. So those are some things for you to look forward to the rest of this month, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you all very much.